Caring black boy helps elderly white neighbor. The next day, police surprise him. Liam, a kind teenager, was riding his bike on a warm, sunny afternoon. He loved these rides through the neighborhood, enjoying the sights and sounds around him. As he turned onto Maple Street, he noticed something unusual. Mrs. Wilson, an old lady who lived nearby, was standing in front of her small yellow house, looking upset. She was trying to fix an old TV on her front lawn, but she seemed frustrated. Liam felt concerned. Mrs. Wilson had always been nice to him, offering warm smiles and sometimes even fresh cookies when he passed by. But lately she seemed sad, spending less time in her garden, where she loved to take care of her roses. Without thinking twice, Liam decided to stop and help her. He rode his bike over to Mrs. Wilson's house and called out softly, "Hi, Mrs. Wilson. Is everything okay?" Mrs. Wilson looked up, surprised to see Liam. "Oh, hello, Liam," she said with a mix of warmth and frustration in her voice. "This old TV isn't working anymore. I was hoping to watch my favorite show this afternoon, but now I can't." She gestured sadly at the TV. Liam felt sorry for her. He knew how much she loved watching her afternoon shows and talking about them with his mom. Seeing her so upset made him want to help. "Maybe I can fix it," Liam offered, getting off his bike and walking over to the TV. "I'm pretty good with electronics. Can I take a look?" Mrs. Wilson's eyes brightened with hope. "Oh, that would be so kind of you, Liam. I'd be so grateful." Liam knelt down next to the TV and started checking the cords to make sure they were all plugged in properly. As he worked, he noticed how Mrs. Wilson seemed to relax a little. He realized that maybe she didn't just need her TV fixed. Maybe she needed a friend too. Liam kept working on the TV, carefully removing the back panel to check the wires inside. Mrs. Wilson watched him closely, amazed at how confident he seemed, even though he was still young. After a few minutes, Liam found the problem. "I think I found what's wrong," he said. "There's a loose connection here. Let me just fix it." With careful hands, Liam reconnected a small wire, and suddenly the TV came to life. The screen flickered and then showed a clear picture. Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened with happiness. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed, clapping her hands. "You did it, Liam. You really did it." Liam smiled proudly as he stood up and dusted off his jeans. "It wasn't too hard," he said modestly. "I'm just glad I could help." Tears of joy filled Mrs. Wilson's eyes. "Thank you so much, Liam," she said with a shaky voice. "You have no idea how much this means to me. This TV was a gift from my late husband. I thought it was gone forever." Liam felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know how important the TV was to Mrs. Wilson, and now he was even happier that he had fixed it. Mrs. Wilson suddenly had an idea. "Oh, I know. Why don't you come inside for some cookies? I just baked a fresh batch this morning. It's the least I can do to thank you." Liam's eyes lit up at the thought of cookies. "That sounds great, Mrs. Wilson. Thank you." As they walked towards the house, Mrs. Wilson gently placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "You're a very special young man, Liam," she said softly. "Your parents must be so proud of you." Liam felt a warm glow of happiness as they stepped inside. He hadn't just fixed a TV today. He had made Mrs. Wilson smile, and that felt even better than fixing anything else. Liam sat at Mrs. Wilson's kitchen table, his eyes wide with excitement as she placed a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies in front of him. The sweet smell filled the cozy room, making his mouth water. "Here you go, dear," Mrs. Wilson said, setting down a glass of cold milk beside the cookies. "Enjoy." Liam took a big bite of a cookie, loving the gooey chocolate chips. "These are amazing, Mrs. Wilson," he said with his mouth full of cookie. Mrs. Wilson laughed, her eyes shining with happiness. "I'm so glad you like them. It's been a while since I've had someone to bake for." As they enjoyed their snack, Mrs. Wilson started sharing stories from her life. She talked about her late husband, who was a brave police officer and had helped their community for many years. Her eyes got watery as she spoke of him, and Liam felt sad for her. "It's been quiet since he passed," Mrs. Wilson said softly. "Sometimes the house feels so empty." Liam listened closely, feeling a mix of sadness and care for the kind elderly woman. He realized that Mrs. Wilson had been feeling lonely, and it made his heart ache for her. "I'm sorry you've been feeling lonely, Mrs. Wilson," Liam said, gently patting her hand. "That must be really hard." Mrs. Wilson smiled at him, touched by his kindness. "You're a very sweet boy, Liam. Your visit today has made my whole week better." Liam beamed at her words, feeling a warm happiness inside. He was glad he could make Mrs. Wilson feel better, even if it was just by fixing her TV and eating cookies with her. As they finished their snack, Mrs. Wilson's eyes brightened with an idea. "You know, Liam," she said, "you're welcome to visit any time you'd like. I always have fresh cookies, and I'd love the company." Liam's face lit up with a big grin. "Really? That would be awesome, Mrs. Wilson. I'd love to come visit you again." Mrs. Wilson reached out and gently squeezed Liam's hand. "You've brought so much joy into this old house today, Liam. Thank you for that." Liam pedaled his bike home, his heart light and his spirit soaring. The warm afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban streets as he turned into his driveway. He couldn't wait to tell his parents about his afternoon with Mrs. Wilson. As he walked through the front door, the familiar scent of his mom's homemade lasagna filled the air. "Mom, Dad, I'm home," Liam called out, his voice full of excitement. Mr. and Mrs. Miller came out from the kitchen, smiles on their faces. "Welcome home, sweetie," Mrs. Miller said, wiping her hands on her apron. "How was your bike ride?" Liam's words spilled out quickly. "It was great. I helped Mrs. Wilson fix her TV, and then she invited me in for cookies." Mr. Miller's eyebrows went up in surprise. "Mrs. Wilson from down the street? That was very kind of you, son." Liam nodded eagerly. "Yeah, she was trying to carry it out to the curb, but I offered to take a look at it. It wasn't too hard to fix." Mrs. Miller's eyes shone with pride. "That's wonderful, Liam. I'm sure Mrs. Wilson really appreciated your help." "She did," Liam said, his voice softening. "She seemed kind of lonely. I think she was just happy to have someone to talk to." Mr. Miller placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "You did a good thing today, son. Helping others, especially our neighbors, is so important. It's what builds a strong community." Mrs. Miller nodded in agreement. "That's right. And it's especially important to look out for our elderly neighbors. They often need a little extra help and company." Liam felt a warm glow of pride in his chest. He was glad his parents were happy with what he'd done. "Mrs. Wilson said I could visit her anytime. Is that okay?" Liam's parents exchanged a look of understanding. "Of course it is," Mr. Miller said. "We're very proud of you for helping Mrs. Wilson. You showed real kindness and care today." The next day, Liam woke up early, excited to visit Mrs. Wilson again. After breakfast, he jumped on his bike and rode down the street, his heart filled with happiness. As he got closer to Mrs. Wilson's house, he saw her in her garden, taking care of her flowers. Her face lit up with a big smile when she saw him. "Liam, what a lovely surprise," Mrs. Wilson called out, waving her gardening gloves in the air. Liam parked his bike and walked over to her. "Hi, Mrs. Wilson. I just wanted to check on you and see how the TV is working." Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkled with happiness. "Oh, it's working perfectly, dear. You did such a great job. Would you like to come inside for a bit?" Liam eagerly nodded. "Sure, I'd love to." They walked into the cozy living room where the TV was proudly standing. Mrs. Wilson motioned for Liam to sit on the sofa with flower patterns. "Can I get you something to drink? Maybe some lemonade?" she offered. "That sounds great, thank you," Liam replied politely. As Mrs. Wilson busied herself in the kitchen, Liam looked around the room. He noticed photos of a younger Mrs. Wilson with a man in a police uniform. When Mrs. Wilson returned with 2 glasses of lemonade, Liam couldn't help but ask, "Is that your husband in the photos?" Mrs. Wilson's smile softened. "Yes, that's my Robert. He was a police officer for over 30 years. He passed away 5 years ago." Liam felt a pang of sadness. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson. He looks like he was a great man." "He was," she said softly, "the kindest, bravest soul I ever knew." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their lemonade. Then Mrs. Wilson brightened up. "How about we watch some TV together? There's a lovely nature show on right now." Liam eagerly nodded, and Mrs. Wilson turned on the TV. As they watched colorful birds fly across the screen, they chatted about the animals, sharing interesting facts they knew. The afternoon passed quickly, filled with laughter and stories. Liam told Mrs. Wilson about school and his hobbies while she shared tales from her younger days. As the sun began to set, Liam realized it was time to go home. "I should probably get going, Mrs. Wilson. Thank you for having me over." Mrs. Wilson gently patted his hand. "Thank you for coming, Liam. You've brightened my day more than you know." As the days turned into weeks, Liam's visits to Mrs. Wilson's house became a regular part of his routine. Every few days after school, he would hop on his bike and ride down the street, his heart full of excitement. Mrs. Wilson always greeted him with a warm smile and open arms. "There's my favorite young man," she would exclaim, her eyes twinkling with joy. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, spending their afternoons together in Mrs. Wilson's cozy living room. Sometimes they would watch TV, other times they would just sit and talk. Liam found himself looking forward to these visits more and more. One sunny afternoon, as they sat sipping lemonade, Mrs. Wilson pulled out an old photo album. "I thought you might like to see some pictures from when I was young," she said, her voice filled with memories. Liam leaned in closer, fascinated by the black and white photos. "Wow, Mrs. Wilson, is that really you?" he asked, pointing to a picture of a young woman in a beautiful dress. Mrs. Wilson chuckled. "Yes, that's me on my wedding day. I was just 22 years old." As they flipped through the pages, Mrs. Wilson shared stories from her past. She told Liam about growing up during simpler times, about meeting her husband Robert at a dance, and about the adventures they had together. "Robert and I traveled all over the country in our little camper van," she said, her eyes distant with memories. "Those were some of the happiest days of my life." Liam listened carefully, paying close attention to every word. He imagined what it must have been like to live in those days. In return, Liam shared his own dreams with Mrs. Wilson. "I want to be an engineer when I grow up," he said. "I love fixing things and figuring out how they work." Mrs. Wilson smiled and nodded. "That's wonderful, Liam. You definitely have a talent for it. I bet you'll invent something amazing one day." Liam smiled widely at her encouraging words. "Do you really think so?" he asked. "I know so," Mrs. Wilson replied with a gentle smile. "You have a bright future ahead of you, young man." As they continued to share stories and dreams, the bond between them grew stronger. Liam found a good listener and a wise guide in Mrs. Wilson, while Mrs. Wilson saw in Liam a source of youthful energy and hope for the future. One evening, while the Miller family was having dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Miller exchanged knowing glances. They had noticed how excited Liam always seemed after visiting Mrs. Wilson. His eyes sparkled, and he would eagerly share stories of their time together. "So, Liam," Mr. Miller began with a smile, "you've been spending a lot of time with Mrs. Wilson lately. How is she doing?" Liam's face lit up at the mention of his elderly friend. "She's great, Dad. Today, she showed me old photos from when she was young. Did you know she and her husband traveled all over the country in a camper van?" Mrs. Miller chuckled softly. "That sounds like quite an adventure. It's wonderful that she's sharing those memories with you." As Liam continued to talk excitedly about his visits with Mrs. Wilson, his parents listened closely, their hearts swelling with pride. When there was a pause in the conversation, Mr. Miller spoke with warmth in his voice. "You know, son, your mother and I are really proud of you for what you're doing for Mrs. Wilson." Liam looked up from his plate, surprised. "Really? But I'm not doing anything special. I just like spending time with her." Miller reached out and squeezed Liam's hand. "That's exactly what makes it special, sweetie. You're making a big difference in her life just by being there for her." Mr. Miller nodded in agreement. That's right. We've noticed how much happier Mrs. Wilson seems these days. Your friendship means a lot to her. Liam felt a warm glow inside at his parents' words. He hadn't really thought about the impact he was having on Mrs. Wilson's life. He just knew he enjoyed their time together. We're so proud of you for realizing that Mrs. Wilson needed a friend, Mrs. Miller continued, her eyes shining. It takes a kind and caring heart to reach out to someone like that. Over the next few weeks, Liam spent more and more time at Mrs. Wilson's house. Each visit brought a new task for him to help with, and he was always eager to lend a hand. One sunny afternoon, Liam arrived to find Mrs. and Wilson struggling with a stubborn jar lid. Oh, Liam, she said with relief. I'm so glad you're here. These old hands just aren't as strong as they used to be. Liam smiled and took the jar from her. With a quick twist, he opened the lid. There you go, Mrs. Wilson. Easy peasy. Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkled with warmth. What would I do without you, dear? As the days went by, Liam helped with all sorts of little jobs around the house. He changed light bulbs that were too high for Mrs. Wilson to reach, watered her favorite plants, and even learned how to make her favorite tea just the way she liked it. One day, while Liam was helping Mrs. Wilson sort through old photo albums, she paused at a picture of a young boy. That's my late husband when he was about your age, she said softly. You remind me so much of him, always ready to help, always with a smile on your face. Liam felt a lump in his throat. Really, he asked, touched by what she said. Mrs. Wilson nodded, her eyes misty. Oh, yes. If we had grandchildren, I imagine they might have been just like you. From that moment on, something changed between them. Mrs. Wilson started treating Liam like a grandmother would, always making sure he had a snack when he visited and checking if he was warm enough when the weather got chilly. For Liam, Mrs. Wilson became more than just a neighbor he helped out. She became someone he could talk to about anything. She always had wise words or a funny story to share. Liam began to look forward to their time together, eager to hear more about her life and to share his own dreams and worries. As the autumn leaves started to fall, Liam realized that what had begun as a simple act of kindness had grown into something much more special. Mrs. Wilson wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She had become family. One crisp Saturday morning, Liam woke up with a bright idea. He bounced down the stairs, almost tripping over his own feet in excitement. His parents were in the kitchen, sipping their morning coffee. Mom, Dad, Liam blurted out, I want you to meet Mrs. Wilson. Mr. Miller lowered his newspaper, his eyebrows raised. The neighbor you've been helping out? Liam nodded eagerly. Yeah, she's really nice, and I think you'd like her. Mrs. Miller smiled warmly. That sounds lovely, honey. Why don't we go over this afternoon? Liam's face lit up. Really, that'd be great. As the afternoon approached, Liam felt a mix of excitement and nerves. He wanted his parents to like Mrs. Wilson as much as he did. When the time came, the Miller family walked over to Mrs. Wilson's house together. Liam knocked on the door, bouncing on his toes. When Mrs. Wilson opened it, her face broke into a wide smile. Liam, what a wonderful surprise. Hi, Mrs. Wilson, Liam said, beaming. I wanted you to meet my parents. Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkled as she looked at Mr. and Mrs. Miller. Oh my, it's so nice to finally meet you. Please, come in. As they settled into Mrs. Wilson's cozy living room, Liam watched nervously as his parents and Mrs. Wilson began to chat. But his worry melted away when he saw his mom laughing at one of Mrs. Wilson's jokes, and his dad leaning in to hear a story about her late husband's time as a police officer. Mrs. Miller turned to Liam, her eyes soft with understanding. Now I see why you enjoy spending time here so much, sweetie. Mrs. Wilson is delightful. Mr. Miller nodded in agreement. It's wonderful to see how much joy you two bring to each other's lives. Liam felt a warm glow in his chest. He looked at Mrs. Wilson, who winked at him, her eyes twinkling with happiness. In that moment, Liam knew that his two families had become one, bound together by love and kindness. As the weeks passed, the Millers began to include Mrs. Wilson more and more in their family activities. It started with a simple invitation to Sunday dinner. Liam's mother called Mrs. Wilson on a Friday afternoon. Her voice was warm and friendly. "Mrs. Wilson, we'd love to have you join us for dinner this Sunday. Liam talks about you so much, we feel like you're already part of the family." Mrs. Wilson's voice shook with emotion as she accepted the invitation. "Oh my, that's so kind of you. I'd be delighted." When Sunday came, Liam was so excited he could hardly wait. He helped his mom set the table and guests, making sure everything was just right for their special guest. When Mrs. Wilson arrived, the house smelled like Mrs. Miller's famous pot roast, and everyone was chatting happily. During dinner, Mr. Miller told funny stories from work while Mrs. Wilson shared stories about her adventures with her late husband. Liam was filled with joy as he watched his parents and Mrs. Wilson laugh together, like they had known each other for years. The Sunday dinners soon became a regular thing, and before long, the Millers were including Mrs. Wilson in other family activities too. One sunny Saturday, they invited her to join them for a picnic at the local park. As they laid out their blanket under a shady oak tree, Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkled with delight. "I haven't been on a picnic in years," she said, her voice full of wonder. Liam helped her get comfortable on the blanket. They spent the afternoon eating sandwiches, playing frisbee with Mrs. Wilson cheering them on, and feeding the ducks at the pond. As weeks turned into months, Mrs. Wilson became a big part of the Miller family's life. She joined them for movie nights, helped Mrs. Miller in her garden, and even came along on a trip to the local museum. With every outing and shared meal, their bond grew stronger. For Mrs. Wilson, these moments felt like a new beginning. The loneliness that once filled her heart began to disappear, replaced by the warmth and love of her new family. And for Liam, seeing the joy on Mrs. Wilson's face whenever she joined in their activities made him feel very happy. One sunny afternoon, Liam was sprawled on the living room floor, working on his latest electronic project. His fingers skillfully moved tiny wires and pieces as he hummed a cheerful tune. The house was quiet, except for the soft clicks of his tools and the gentle hum of the ceiling fan. Suddenly, a loud knock at the front door broke the peaceful silence. Liam looked up, curiosity on his young face. Mr. Miller, who had been reading the newspaper in his favorite armchair, set it aside and stood up. "I'll get it," he called out, walking towards the door. As Mr. Miller opened the door, Liam stretched his neck to see who it was. To his surprise, he saw Mrs. Wilson standing on the porch, but she wasn't alone. Next to her stood a tall police officer in full uniform, his shiny badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Liam's heart skipped a beat, and his mind filled with questions. Why was Mrs. Wilson here with a police officer? Was something wrong? He quickly jumped to his feet, forgetting all about his project on the floor. Mr. Miller's voice sounded concerned as he greeted the unexpected visitors. "Mrs. Wilson, officer, is everything okay?" Mrs. Wilson's face showed a mix of feelings: worry, excitement, and something Liam couldn't quite figure out. She nervously wrung her hands as she looked up at Mr. Miller. "Oh, Mr. Miller," she began, her voice trembling a little. "I'm so sorry to bother you like this, but something has happened, and I didn't know who else to turn to." The police officer beside her nodded seriously, his presence both comforting and a little scary. Liam slowly moved closer to the door, his heart beating fast with both fear and curiosity. Mr. Miller stepped aside, letting Mrs. Wilson and the police officer come in. "Please come in," he said, his voice filled with worry. Mrs. Miller came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes wide with surprise. Liam stood frozen, his young mind full of questions. He watched the adults walk into the living room, his stomach tightening with anxiety. What could have happened to make Mrs. Wilson come here with a police officer? "Can I get you anything? Water? Tea?" Mrs. Miller asked, her kind nature showing, even though the air was tense. Mrs. Wilson shook her head, her silver hair shining in the light. "No, thank you, dear. I'm sorry to disturb you like this." The police officer, a tall man with kind eyes, nodded politely to the Millers. "Ma'am, sir, I'm Officer Ramirez. Mrs. Wilson asked me to come with her." Liam moved closer to his parents, wanting to feel safe. His father placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but Liam could feel his hand shaking a little. "What's going on?" Mr. Miller asked, his voice calm but filled with worry. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Wilson?" Mrs. Wilson wrung her hands, her eyes moving between the Millers and Officer Ramirez. I didn't know who else to turn to," she said, her voice shaking. Liam's heart beat faster. He had never seen Mrs. Wilson so upset. She was always strong and wise when they spent time together in the afternoons. Seeing her so sad made him feel scared and helpless. "Maybe we should all sit down," Mrs. Miller suggested, gently guiding Mrs. Wilson to the couch. Everyone else followed, with Liam sitting on the armrest next to his mother. Officer Ramirez cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Wilson came to the station today with some worries." His tone was kind but serious. Liam looked at Mrs. Wilson, his eyebrows scrunched up with worry. She looked back at him, and for a moment her worried face softened. She reached out and gently patted his hand. "Oh, Liam," she said softly, "I'm so sorry to worry you like this. You've been such a good friend to me." The room went silent, the air thick with questions no one was asking. Liam felt torn between wanting to know what was happening and being afraid of what Mrs. Wilson might say next. He glanced at his parents, seeing the same confusion in their faces. Officer Ramirez leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, Liam, I want to assure you there's no trouble here. No one is in danger, and no one has done anything wrong." A wave of relief filled the room, and Liam felt some of the tension leave his body, but his curiosity only grew stronger. Mrs. Wilson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue Mrs. Miller had quietly handed her. "I'm so sorry for scaring you all," she began, her voice trembling. "It's just that, well, I've been thinking a lot about my dear Henry lately." Liam knew Henry was Mrs. Wilson's late husband, a decorated police officer she often spoke fondly of during their afternoon chats. "You see," Mrs. Wilson continued, her eyes filling with tears. "Today would have been our 50th wedding anniversary," Mrs. Wilson began, her voice trembling as she tried to stay calm. The Miller family exchanged sad looks, while Liam felt a lump in his throat. He had never seen Mrs. Wilson cry before, and it made his heart hurt. Mrs. Wilson continued, "I was feeling so lonely, and I ended up at the police station where Henry used to work. That's where I met Officer Ramirez," she said, pointing to the friendly policeman. Officer Ramirez smiled gently. "Mrs. Wilson told me about her husband, their life together, and the wonderful friendship she's formed with your family, especially with you, Liam." Liam felt proud at the officer's words, but his worry for Mrs. Wilson quickly replaced it. Mrs. Wilson reached out and held Liam's hand. "Liam, you've brought so much happiness into my life these past few weeks. You've reminded me what it's like to have family around," she said. She turned to the Millers, her eyes filled with emotion. "You've all been so kind, including me in your lives," she said, pausing to take a deep breath. "Today I realize that I don't want to be alone anymore. I hope." Mrs. Wilson's voice wavered, full of emotion. She took a deep breath, her eyes shining with tears. "My Henry," she began, her voice soft and full of love. "He was a decorated police officer. He spent his life helping others, always putting the community first." Liam listened closely, his young heart swelling with admiration for Mrs. Wilson's late husband. He had heard bits and pieces about Henry before, but never the full story. "Henry believed that kindness was the most powerful force in the world," Mrs. Wilson continued, gently squeezing Liam's hand. "He used to say that a single act of kindness could change someone's entire life." The Millers nodded, understanding this simple but deep truth. Mrs. Dale Wilson looked at Liam, her eyes warm. "And you, dear Liam, you've proven Henry right. Your kindness has filled a hole in my heart that I thought would never be whole again." Liam felt a lump in his throat, touched by Mrs. Wilson's words. He hadn't realized just how much his simple acts of friendship had meant to her. "When Henry passed away," Mrs. Wilson's voice quivered, "I felt so alone, like a part of me had gone with him. But then you came along, Liam, with your bright smile and your willingness to help." She paused, looking at the Millers. "And all of you, welcoming me into your lives, it's been like finding a family again." Officer Ramirez nodded, his smile gentle. "Mrs. Wilson told me how you fixed her TV, Liam, and how that simple act of kindness blossomed into this beautiful friendship." Liam blushed, feeling both proud and humble. He hadn't thought his actions were anything special, but clearly they had made a big difference in Mrs. Wilson's life. "You see," Mrs. Wilson continued, her voice growing stronger, "Liam's kindness didn't just fix my TV, it fixed something in me that I thought was broken forever. It reminded me of the joy of connection, of family." Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears as she continued. "You see, Henry and I never had children of our own," she said softly. The room grew quiet, everyone listening closely. Liam felt a pang in his heart. He never knew this about Mrs. Wilson, and it made him understand her loneliness even more. "After Henry passed," Mrs. Wilson dabbed her eyes with a tissue, "I felt so alone. The house was so quiet, so empty. I didn't know what to do with myself." Mr. and Mrs. Miller exchanged sympathetic looks, feeling sorry for their elderly neighbor. Mrs. Wilson turned to Liam, her eyes full of love. "But then you came along, Liam. Your visits, your kindness, it's been like a ray of sunshine in my life." Liam felt a lump in his throat again. He hadn't realized just how much his visits had meant to Mrs. Wilson. "Every time you come over, every story we share, every moment we spend together," Mrs. Wilson continued, her voice growing stronger, "it fills my heart with so much joy. It's like having the grandson I never had." Liam's eyes widened at these words, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest, a mix of surprise and happiness. Mrs. Wilson reached out and held Liam's hand. "Liam," she said, "you've become like family to me. You've brought joy back into my home and given me a reason to smile again." Liam gently squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth in her words. He looked at his parents, who were smiling proudly, and then back at Mrs. Wilson. "I feel the same way, Mrs. Wilson," Liam said softly. "I love spending time with you. You're like family to me, too." Mrs. Wilson's face lit up with happiness, her earlier tears replaced by a bright smile. The bond between them, built through small acts of kindness, had grown into something special and deep. The police officer who had been sitting quietly beside Mrs. Wilson stepped forward. His eyes were kind and his smile was gentle as he spoke to the Miller family. "I'm Officer Martinez," he said, his voice warm and comforting. "I was a good friend of Henry, Mrs. Wilson's husband." Liam looked up at the officer, curious. He could see the respect in Officer Martinez's eyes as he talked about Henry. "Henry was one of the best officers I've ever known," Officer Martinez continued. "He spent his life helping others and making our community a better place." Mrs. Wilson nodded with a proud smile, remembering her husband. "That's right," she said softly. "Henry always believed in helping others." Officer Martinez turned to Liam, his expression serious but kind. "Mrs. Wilson has told me all about you, Liam. She told me how you've been helping her and keeping her company. It's exactly what Henry would have loved to see." Liam felt a mix of emotions, pride, happiness, and a bit of shyness at being the center of attention. He hadn't realized his simple acts of kindness would mean so much to so many people. "You see," Officer Martinez explained, "Mrs. Wilson wants to honor Henry's memory, and she believes the best way to do that is by supporting you, Liam." Liam's eyes widened in surprise. He looked at Mrs. Wilson, who was smiling at him with tears in her eyes. "That's right, dear," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice full of emotion. "Henry always believed in helping young people reach their full potential, and that's exactly what I want to do for you." Mr. and Mrs. Miller listened closely, their faces showing surprise and gratitude. They hadn't expected this when Mrs. Wilson and Officer Martinez came to their door. "Mrs. Wilson has set up a college fund for you, Liam," Officer Martinez explained. "She wants to make sure you have the chance to follow your dreams, just like Henry would have wanted." Liam was stunned. He looked from Officer Martinez to Mrs. Wilson, then to his parents, trying to take in this amazing news. The kindness he had shown, the friendship he had offered, was coming back to him in ways he could never have imagined. Officer Martinez reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. With a warm smile, he handed it to Liam. "Mrs. Wilson asked me to give this to you," he said gently. Liam's hands trembled a little as he took the envelope. He looked at Mrs. Wilson, who nodded encouragingly, her eyes full of joyful tears. "Go ahead, dear," Mrs. Wilson said softly. "Read it." Liam carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. As he began to read, his eyes widened and his mouth dropped open in surprise. "Dear Liam," the letter began, "your kindness and care have touched my heart in ways I never thought possible. You've brought light back into my life, reminding me of the good that still exists in this world." Liam's parents leaned in, listening closely as their son read the letter aloud. Mrs. Miller placed a comforting hand on her husband's shoulder, both of them overwhelmed by the generosity they were witnessing. "To honor my husband's memory and to make sure your bright spirit keeps shining, I've decided to set up a scholarship fund in your name," Liam read, his voice shaking with emotion. "This fund will give you the means to follow your dreams, whatever they may be." Mrs. Wilson smiled softly, watching as Liam took in the news. "I want you to have every opportunity to make a difference in this world, just as you've made a difference in mine," the letter continued. Liam looked up from the letter and saw Mrs. Wilson. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, feeling very thankful. Officer Martinez stepped forward and put a gentle hand on Liam's shoulder. "You don't need to say anything, son. Your actions have already spoken for you." Liam lowered the letter, his hands shaking a bit. He looked at Mrs. Wilson with tears in his eyes. The room was very quiet as everyone felt the weight of her kindness. Mrs. Miller broke the silence. "Oh, Mrs. Wilson," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "This is just incredible." Mr. Miller nodded, wiping a tear from his eye. "We don't know how to thank you," he added softly. Liam stood up slowly, holding the letter tightly. He walked over to Mrs. Wilson, who opened her arms. Liam hugged her tightly, burying his face in her shoulder as tears streamed down his cheeks. "Thank you." Liam whispered into Mrs. Wilson's sweater. "Thank you so much." Mrs. Wilson patted Liam's back gently, her own tears falling. "No, my dear boy," she said softly. "I should be thanking you. You've brought so much joy into my life." Mr. and Mrs. Miller joined the hug, wrapping everyone in a warm embrace. The room was filled with quiet sobs and sniffles as they all shared this special moment of gratitude and love. Officer Martinez stood to the side, watching with a warm smile, touched by the kindness and love in the room. When they pulled apart, Liam looked up at Mrs. Wilson with red eyes. "I promise I'll make you proud," he said earnestly. "I'll use this chance to help others just like you and your husband did." Mrs. Wilson cupped Liam's face in her hands, her eyes twinkling with affection. "My dear, you've already made me prouder than I could have ever imagined," she said warmly. After a while, Mrs. Wilson reached into her purse with trembling hands and pulled out a small velvet box. Her eyes were misty with memories. "Liam," she said softly, "there's something else I'd like to give you." Liam looked at her, curious and still tearful. Mrs. Wilson opened the box to show a beautiful old watch inside. The gold face shimmered in the light, and the watch's hands ticked steadily. "This was my husband's most cherished possession," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice full of emotion. "He wore it every day while helping others, and it became a symbol of his dedication." Liam's eyes widened as he understood the importance of the gift. He looked from the watch to Mrs. Wilson and back, speechless. Mrs. Wilson carefully took the watch out of the box and held it out to Liam. "I want you to have it," she said. "It's a reminder of the love and selflessness that you are now a part of." With trembling hands, Liam took the watch. He turned it over, feeling its weight and the special engravings on the back. He could sense the love and history in it. "I don't know what to say," Liam stammered, feeling overwhelmed. "This is too much." Mrs. Wilson shook her head, smiling through her tears. "It's just right," she said. "You've shown the same kindness and selflessness that my husband did every day. This watch belongs with you now." Liam carefully put the watch on his wrist, feeling its comforting weight. He looked up at Mrs. Wilson, his eyes full of determination and gratitude. "I promise," he said seriously, "I'll honor this gift. I'll wear it every day and remember the kindness and love it represents. I'll do my best to live up to the legacy it carries." Mrs. Wilson gave Liam another warm hug. Her heart felt so happy and proud. "I know you will, my dear," she whispered. The Millers looked at each other with warm hearts full of love for Liam and Mrs. Wilson. Mr. Miller cleared his throat and spoke with a shaky voice. "Mrs. Wilson, we have been thinking about something important." Mrs. Wilson looked up with her eyes shining with tears of joy, curious about what Mr. Miller was going to say. Mrs. Miller stepped closer and put a gentle hand on Mrs. Wilson's shoulder. "We have seen how much joy you've brought to Liam and to us," she said softly. "You've become an important part of our family." Liam's eyes brightened, and he looked from his parents to Mrs. Wilson with a hopeful smile. Mr. Miller continued, "We would like to ask you, Mrs. Wilson, if you would think about being a permanent part of our family. We want you to know that you'll always have a place with us, not just as a neighbor or a friend, but as family." Mrs. Wilson's hand went to her mouth in surprise. Her eyes widened as she was overwhelmed by the offer. "You want me to be part of your family?" she asked, her voice very soft. Mrs. Miller nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes, we do. We would be so happy if you would say yes." Liam stepped forward and took Mrs. Wilson's hand. "Please say yes," he said earnestly. "You're already like a grandmother to me." Mrs. Wilson looked around at the loving faces. She felt a warm feeling in her chest, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Tears of joy ran down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I'd love to be part of your family. You've already given me so much, and now this. I can't say how grateful I am." The Millers hugged Mrs. Wilson with Liam in the middle, his arms around his new grandmother. The room was filled with laughter and happy tears as they celebrated their new family. As weeks went by, Liam worked hard in school with new energy. The love and support from his new grandmother, Mrs. Wilson, made him want to do his best. Every afternoon, after school, Liam would hurry over to Mrs. Wilson's house to tell her about his day. Mrs. Wilson always smiled when Liam came in, carrying his backpack and books. She loved listening to him talk about his schoolwork with so much excitement. One day, Liam came in, jumping with joy, and told Mrs. Wilson he got an A+ on his science project. Mrs. Wilson was so proud and asked him to tell her all about it. Liam shared his project details, and Mrs. Wilson felt a big wave of love for him. She had set up a special fund to help Liam with school, and it made him work even harder. He spent many late nights studying and early mornings reviewing his notes. His teachers noticed how much he had changed. He was always eager to answer questions, and his work was much better. He even started to do better in subjects he used to find hard. One evening, while Liam was doing his homework at Mrs. Wilson's kitchen table, she brought him cookies and milk. She told him softly that she was so proud of him and that he had a bright future. Liam looked up and thanked her, saying, her support made him want to do his best. As time went by, Mrs. Wilson became a beloved part of Liam's family. One fall day, she watched Liam at his school's science fair with a big smile. His project about renewable energy was impressive. Later, when Liam won first place, the family celebrated together, and Mrs. Wilson shared stories about her late husband's adventures as a police officer. Liam listened closely, imagining his bravery. Mrs. Wilson attended school events and parent-teacher meetings, always proud of Liam. She often helped him with homework at her kitchen table, sharing stories from her past to make learning fun. She told Liam that when she was young, they didn't have the fancy tools they do now and had to learn things in a simpler way. Liam looked up, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Really? How did you manage?" he asked. Mrs. Wilson laughed and started telling a story about her school days. Liam giggled and wanted to hear more. As winter came, the Millers invited Mrs. Wilson to stay in their spare room. This made her very happy, and she said yes with a big smile. Now every morning smelled like Mrs. Wilson's famous pancakes, and every evening the family sat together in the living room, sharing stories and laughing. As the winter went on, Liam and Mrs. Wilson became closer. They spent their afternoons together, laughing and talking. One snowy day, while they sipped hot cocoa by the fire, Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkled. "You know, Liam," she said warmly, "when I was your age, I wanted to be a famous chef." Liam's eyes grew wide. "Really? I didn't know that." Mrs. Wilson smiled and said, "Yes, I spent lots of time in the kitchen with my mother, learning her secret recipes." Liam leaned in, wanting to know more. "What happened to that dream?" he asked. Mrs. Wilson softly replied, "I met your grandpa, fell in love, and found a new dream, building a life with him." Liam thought for a moment and asked, "Do you regret not being a chef?" Mrs. Wilson shook her head. "No, not at all. Sometimes our dreams change, and that's okay. The life I had with your grandpa was even better than any dream." Inspired by Mrs. Wilson's story, Liam shared his own dream of becoming an inventor to help people and make the world better. Mrs. Wilson listened with pride. "You have a big heart, Liam," she said, holding his hand. "I know you'll do amazing things." As the weeks passed, their talks became deeper. Liam shared his fears and worries with Mrs. Wilson, things he found hard to tell his parents. Mrs. Wilson also talked about her own struggles, telling stories of strength and courage that inspired Liam. Their friendship grew stronger with every story. Liam admired Mrs. Wilson's strength, and she admired his kindness and curiosity. One night, while they worked on a puzzle, Liam said seriously, "I'm really glad you're part of our family now." Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Oh, Liam," she said, her voice full of emotion, "you have no idea how much that means to me. You've brought so much happiness into my life." When spring was coming, Liam was worried about a big school project. He had to make a presentation about an important event in history and how it affects us today. Liam didn't know how to start or what to do. One afternoon, as he sat at Mrs. Wilson's kitchen table looking worried, she noticed and asked gently, "What's wrong, dear?" while placing a plate of fresh cookies in front of him. Liam pushed his textbook away and sighed. "It's this big project for school," he said. "I don't know how to make it interesting or where to start." Mrs. Wilson's eyes lit up. "History was always my favorite subject," she said, sitting down next to him. "What's your project about?" Liam told Mrs. Wilson about his assignment. She listened closely and then smiled. "This reminds me of a project I did when I was about your age," she began. She told Liam how she had struggled with a similar project until her grandfather helped her. He showed her how to see history as the stories of real people, not just dates and facts. Mrs. Wilson said she made her project interesting by talking about people's personal stories and using everyday objects from the time. Inspired by her story, Liam's eyes lit up. "That's so cool," he said. "I never thought about history like that before." Mrs. Wilson kept sharing her experiences. She talked about creative ways she handled tough school projects and encouraged Liam to think outside the box. As they talked, Liam started writing down ideas, his frustration turning into excitement. Mrs. Wilson watched him with pride and said, "Remember, Liam, every great achievement starts with believing in yourself. You have wonderful ideas and a kind heart. Let that shine in your project. Liam felt confident with Mrs. Wilson's advice and his own creativity. He knew he could make something special. He worked hard on his project, spending hours researching and crafting his presentation. Days went by quickly as he worked, driven by his passion and Mrs. Wilson's encouragement. On presentation day, Liam stood in front of his class confidently. His project about the civil rights movement was vivid and engaging. He used personal stories and everyday objects to make the history come alive, just like Mrs. Wilson suggested. His teacher and classmates were captivated by his unique approach. When Liam finished, the room erupted in applause. His teacher said, "Liam, that was exceptional. Your presentation really brought history to life. I've never seen such a creative approach from a student your age." Liam's cheeks turned red with pride as his classmates gave him compliments. He felt happy knowing he had done well. Later, when he ran into Mrs. Wilson's house, he was glowing with excitement. "Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Wilson," he shouted. "I did it. My project was a huge success." Mrs. Wilson beamed and hugged him. "I'm so proud of you, Liam, but remember, this success is all yours. You did all the hard work." Liam shook his head, looking at Mrs. Wilson with serious eyes. "No, Mrs. Wilson, I couldn't have done it without you. Your stories and advice made a big difference. You helped me see history in a new way." Mrs. Wilson's eyes sparkled with happy tears. She gently patted Liam's hand, filled with love for this amazing boy who brought her so much joy. As time passed, Mrs. Wilson shared more about her late husband, Officer Wilson. She spoke of how he always worked hard for justice, was kind to others, and believed in the power of helping the community. Liam listened closely, absorbing every word. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on Mrs. Wilson's porch, she held her husband's badge in her wrinkled hands. "You know, Liam," she began softly, "Henry always said that true strength comes from helping others." Liam leaned in, curious. "Really? How did he help people?" Mrs. Wilson smiled, her eyes shining. "In many ways. He'd help a lost child find their parents or buy a meal for someone who didn't have enough money. He believed that every small act of kindness could make the world better." Liam nodded, deep in thought. "That's amazing, Mrs. Wilson. I want to be like that too." "You already are, dear," Mrs. Wilson said, patting his hand. "Your kindness to me shows that. But there's always more we can do." In the following weeks, Mrs. Wilson taught Liam about her husband's values: honesty, hard work, and empathy. Liam took these lessons to heart. At school, he stood up for kids being bullied. At home, he helped his parents more without being asked. In the neighborhood, he looked for ways to help, just like Officer Wilson used to. One day, Liam noticed old Mr. Adams struggling with his groceries. He hurried over to help. As they walked to Mr. Adams's house, Liam thought about how proud Mrs. Wilson and Officer Wilson would be. Later, when Liam told Mrs. Wilson about helping Mr. Adams, her eyes sparkled with tears of joy. "Oh, Liam," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Henry would have been so proud of you. You're continuing his legacy beautifully." Liam felt a warm glow inside. He realized that through Mrs. Wilson's stories and lessons, Officer Wilson's spirit lived on in him. Excitedly, Liam walked into the bustling community center. The colorful posters and cheerful volunteers made him feel ready to help. He remembered Mrs. Wilson's tales of her husband's dedication to serving others and felt inspired to follow his example. The center's coordinator, Miss Parker, greeted Liam with a friendly smile. "Welcome, Liam. We're so glad to have you. Are you ready to make a difference?" Liam nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am. I want to help in any way I can." Miss Parker showed Liam around the center, explaining the different programs: a food bank, after-school tutoring, and a small library. Liam was amazed by the many ways he could assist people in his community. For his first task, Liam helped sort donations for the food bank. He carefully organized cans and boxes, ensuring everything was in its place. As he worked, he thought about how each item would help feed a family in need. It filled him with joy, knowing he was making a real difference. In the following weeks, Liam became a regular at the community center. He helped with homework in the after-school program, read stories to younger kids in the library, and even helped organize a neighborhood cleanup day. One afternoon, while Liam was helping an elderly man choose books, he overheard Miss Parker talking to another volunteer. "Liam is special," she said. "He reminds me of Officer Wilson, always ready to help and always with a smile." Liam felt proud. He was living up to the example set by Mrs. Wilson's husband, and it felt amazing. As the weeks turned into months, Liam looked forward to his time at the community center more and more. The happiness he felt from helping others was unlike anything he had ever felt before. He loved seeing people smile and knowing he made their day a little bit better. Liam sat with Mrs. Wilson, excitedly talking about how he was helping people. Mrs. Wilson smiled and said, "Oh, Liam, you're doing just what Henry would have wanted. You're making the world better with your kindness." Later, Liam came home from school looking very sad. He had gotten a big red D on his math test. He went straight to his room without talking to his parents. That evening, Liam went to Mrs. Wilson's house, but he didn't feel like talking about his bad day. Mrs. Wilson noticed and asked, "What's wrong, dear?" Liam told her, "I failed my math test. I studied hard, but I still didn't do well. Maybe I'm not as smart as people think." Mrs. Wilson felt sad for him and gently held his hand. "Everyone has tough times," she said. "That doesn't mean you're not smart." Liam looked at her with tears in his eyes and asked, "Really?" Mrs. Wilson nodded and smiled. "Let me tell you about Henry and me. When we first got married, Henry was studying to be a police officer. He had a hard time with some of his tests, just like you with math. But we worked together. We studied, made flashcards, and played games to help him learn. He didn't give up and ended up passing his tests and becoming a great officer." Liam felt a little better and asked, "Do you think I can do better next time?" Mrs. Wilson squeezed his hand and said, "I know you can. You have me, your parents, and your teachers to help you. Don't be afraid to ask for help." Feeling encouraged, Liam took a deep breath and said, "I won't give up. I'll try harder and ask for help when I need it." Mrs. Wilson smiled proudly and said, "That's the spirit. Let's look at your math test and see where we can figure things out together." Liam took out his test paper and Mrs. Wilson helped him understand the problems. She used simple examples to make math easier, just like she had helped Henry before. Over the next few weeks, Liam worked hard on his schoolwork. He stayed after school for extra help from his math teacher, practiced math with Mrs. Wilson, and even asked his parents to quiz him at dinner. Sometimes it was tough and he wanted to give up, but he remembered Mrs. Wilson's story about Henry and kept going. When the next math test came, Liam felt nervous but ready. As he worked on the test, he could almost hear Mrs. Wilson's voice helping him. When he finished, he felt proud no matter what his score was. A few days later, Liam ran to Mrs. Wilson's house, excitedly waving his test paper. "I did it, Mrs. Wilson," he said, smiling. "I got a B+. Mrs. Wilson was so happy she had tears in her eyes and hugged Liam tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "Hard work and not giving up can help you do anything." Liam felt warm inside. He realized he had learned more than just math. He learned about not giving up, asking for help, and having people who believe in him. As the sun set, Liam and Mrs. Wilson sat on the couch together, the TV quietly on but not really noticed. Liam looked at the watch on his wrist, a special gift from Mrs. Wilson's late husband. He felt it was very important. Mrs. Wilson saw him touching the watch and smiled. She held his hand, old and young fingers clasped together. "You know," she said, "when Henry passed away, I thought I'd never be truly happy again, but you brought sunshine back into my life." Liam felt emotional and held her hand tight. "You've changed my life too, Mrs. Wilson," he said. "You've shown me kindness and how to really help someone." They sat quietly, feeling close. The ticking of the watch seemed to match their hearts. They both felt the special bond they shared. What started as a simple act of helping had become something very important for both of them. Mrs. Wilson saw Liam as the grandson she never had and someone with a bright future. Liam saw Mrs. Wilson as wise and loving, someone he wanted to be like. Have you ever made a special friend like Liam and Mrs. Wilson? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this story, please subscribe to my channel. I spend a lot of time writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support means a lot.